The Making of an Elizabethan Mind, a Classical Curriculum, Lecture 3. Terence, or the Uses of Comedy. There is a story told about Terence, and like all the best stories told about ancient writers, it is almost certainly not true, and is therefore probably worth telling. Julius Caesar, who had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them, read the comedies of Terence and pronounced them exquisite, perfectly constructed, effortlessly elegant, the purest Latin prose he had encountered. And then he added a reservation. There was, he felt, a certain quality missing, a force, a vis comica, he called it. Comic power. The plays were beautiful, Caesar thought, but they did not quite bite. Caesar was a man who bit. So perhaps we should not be entirely surprised by the judgment, but I want to hold it in front of us for a moment, because it tells us something useful. It tells us that even in antiquity, Terence was recognized as a writer whose virtues were of a particular, rather refined kind. He did not assault you. He did not make you raw. He made you see, with a precision that was almost uncomfortable, the exact mechanism by which people deceive themselves and each other. And then he arranged it so that everything worked out tolerably well, while leaving you with the distinct impression that it very easily might not have. This is the man whose plays were set before an 11-year-old boy as his first serious Latin text, not because the schoolmasters thought comedy was important, because Terence's Latin was perfect, pellucid, they called it, clear as water. Every sentence constructed with such care that it could be taken apart like a mechanism and the function of every component identified and named. For a master trying to teach Latin grammar through living prose, Terence was, quite simply, the ideal instrument. The fact that he was also a dramatist of considerable genius was, from the schoolmaster's point of view, a happy coincidence. From our point of view, it is the whole point. So who was he? Publius Terentius Afer. The cognomen Afer means African, and it was not a metaphor. He was born in Carthage, almost certainly around 185 before the Christian era, and came to Rome as a slave in the household of a Roman senator named Terentius Lucanus, from whom he took his name on being freed. How he was educated, whether his master recognized exceptional intelligence and had him taught, or whether he educated himself by some other means, we do not know with certainty. What we know is that by the time he was in his early 20s, he had written a comedy, The Andria, the Woman of Andros, that was good enough to be performed at the Ludi Megalenses, the public games held in honor of the Great Mother in 166 before the Christian era, that it was received well enough that he wrote 5 more. He was taken up by the most distinguished literary circle in Rome, a group surrounding Scipio Aemilianus, the great general and statesman, and his friend Gaius Laelius. These were men of the highest culture and the most sophisticated tastes, and their patronage was both a social fact and, for Terence's enemies, a convenient accusation. It was whispered, with the persistence that attends all such whispers, that Terence's plays were not entirely his own, that Scipio and Laelius, men of education and leisure, had helped him write them, or had written them outright, and allowed the freed slave to take the credit for reasons that were variously speculated upon. Terence addressed this accusation directly in his prologues, which is where we learn about it, with a composure that itself tells us something. He did not deny the friendship. He denied only that the friendship was anything other than an honor. As to the collaboration, he pointed out with a dryness that reads perfectly across 2,000 years that to be thought capable of writing plays that pleased Scipio and Laelius was not, as accusations went, among the more wounding. He died young, sometime around 159 before the Christian era, in his mid-20s, on a journey to Greece. The ancient sources are vague about the cause. Some say illness. Some say he was lost at sea along with the manuscripts of 108 plays, translated from the Greek. One feels the last detail may have been added by someone who thought the story needed more pathos. It had, by any reasonable measure, sufficient pathos already. 6 plays survive. 6 plays on a life of perhaps 25 years and 1,500 years of continuous pedagogical use. There is a lesson in there about the relationship between quantity and permanence, though I shall resist the temptation to draw it explicitly. The 6 plays are all what the Romans called fabulae palliata, comedies in the Greek style, adapted from the Greek new comedy playwright Menander, whose originals have largely not survived. This is one of the small ironies of classical scholarship. We know Menander primarily through Terence's versions of him, which means we know the copy better than the original, which is not an entirely unfamiliar situation in literary history. Terence adapted rather than translated. He combined plots from different Greek originals, a practice his critics called contamination, which he addressed in his prologues with the same unruffled equanimity he brought to the plagiarism accusation. The man had, one feels, a remarkable temperament. The world of Terentian comedy is a recognizable one, and this is part of its pedagogical value. It is the world of the prosperous Roman household. There are fathers, usually well-meaning, but either excessively strict or excessively indulgent, and the plays are in a sense an extended meditation on which of these failings is worse. There are sons, young men in the grip of passions, that are entirely understandable and entirely inconvenient. There are the objects of these passions, young women whose social position determines the structure of the plot. They are clever slaves who are in many ways the most interesting characters in the plays, because they are the ones who actually make things happen, who construct the deceptions and manage the consequences, who understand everyone else's situation rather better than anyone else understands it, and who operate throughout under the constant possibility of severe punishment if things go wrong. And there are the parasites and soldiers and merchants who populate the edges of this world and occasionally drive the plot. What Terence does with this material is not, on the surface, dramatically adventurous. The plots are recognizable. The resolutions are conventionally satisfying. The bad fathers relent. The young men get their girls. The clever slaves are forgiven or freed. But the surface is not where Terence lives. Terence lives in the dialogue, in the precision with which he renders the exact texture of human self-deception, in the way a character will explain his behavior with perfect sincerity and complete logical coherence while remaining entirely unaware of what is actually motivating him. In the way two people can have the same conversation with entirely different understandings of what is being said, and the audience can see both understandings simultaneously, and the effect is not fast but something much quieter and more troubling. Let me give you the most famous line Terence ever wrote, because it has been quoted more continuously and in more contexts than almost any other sentence in Latin literature. It comes from a play called the Houton Timorunenos, the self-tormentor. A character named Tremes is asked why he's involving himself in another man's affairs, and he replies, Homo sum humani nil a me alienum puto. I am a man. I consider nothing human to be foreign to me. Now, the Elizabethan schoolboy who encountered this line was being given in a single sentence of 8 words, a complete statement of the humanist project, the idea that the proper study of mankind is man, that no human situation, however distant in time or place or circumstance, is beyond the reach of sympathetic understanding, that the educated person's response to the unfamiliar is not rejection, but comprehension. This is, when you think about it, a rather radical claim. It is also, as the context of the play makes clear, being used by Cremes to justify sticking his nose into his neighbor's business, which is precisely the kind of gap between noble principle and actual motive that Terence finds irresistible. The line was quoted by Cicero, who admired Terence greatly. It was quoted by Seneca. It was quoted throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. invariably with complete solemnity and invariably without the comic context that gives it its actual flavor. This tells us something both about the power of a good sentence and about the human tendency to abstract wisdom from its circumstances and make it more comfortable in the process. The play in which the line appears is worth dwelling on for a moment because it is the play in which Terence most directly examines the relationship between fathers and sons, which is to say the relationship between the established order and the energy that will either renew it or destroy it. Two fathers in the play have adopted entirely opposite strategies for raising their son. Menedemus has been so harsh, so relentlessly demanding, that his son Clinia has fled abroad in despair. Chrymis has been indulgent to the point of permissiveness, and his son Clitiphor is quietly conducting a ruinous love affair under his father's roof, while his father congratulates himself on his enlightened approach to parenthood. By the end of the play, both fathers have been comprehensively educated. The question Terence refuses to answer, and this is very characteristic of him, is which of them has been more foolish? The Adelpho, the brothers, which was the last play Terence wrote, takes this same opposition and sharpens it to something almost painful. Two brothers have been raised by different methods. Demea has raised his son Ctesippho in strict traditional fashion, all duty and discipline, and the subordination of desire to obligation. His brother Mitio has raised the other son, Aeschinus, in the spirit of friendship and trust, giving him freedom and expecting reason in return. The play appears to be vindicating Mitio's liberal approach. Aeschinus turns out rather well. Ctesippho is conducting a secret love affair with the music girl and lying about it with impressive consistency. And then, in the final act, everything reverses. Demea, who has spent the entire play being proved wrong, suddenly demonstrates that he has been watching and thinking, and delivers a critique of Mitio's liberality that is so pointed, so precisely aimed, that Mitio has no answer to it. The audience, which has spent the evening laughing at the mayor, finds itself in the uncomfortable position of having been played. The strict father, it turns out, understood something. The question is whether it was the right something, and whether understanding it in the way he understood it was itself a kind of failure. Terence does not tell you. This is why Caesar thought him insufficiently forceful. Terence is never going to grab you by the collar and tell you what to think. He's going to construct the situation with such precision that the question is inescapable, and then he is going to leave you with it. For the Elizabethan student reading this in a schoolroom under the eye of a master, who expected grammatical analysis rather than literary criticism, the surface encounter was with perfect Latin. Subject, verb, object, the subjunctive used correctly, the periodic sentence assembled with care. But underneath the grammatical exercise, something else was happening. A mind was being formed that was comfortable with irresolution, that could hold two positions simultaneously without demanding that one of them win, that understood that the most interesting human situations are not the ones with clear moral answers, but the ones where the moral answers are genuinely distributed, genuinely intention, and the best a man can do is act with as much intelligence and honesty as he can muster, knowing that this will probably not be quite enough. That is a very considerable thing to learn from a comedy. It is, in fact, the foundation of a tragic sensibility, which may be why Shakespeare, who had Terence in his bones, was able to write the kind of tragedy he wrote. Tragedy that does not offer the comfort of a villain. Tragedy in which everyone is trying. And the trying is not sufficient, and the gap between intention and outcome is not a moral failing, but simply the nature of things. In our next lecture, we stay with Terence and go deeper into two of the plays, looking specifically at what the Elizabethan reader would have made of the slave characters, the mechanics of comic plotting, and a question that Terence raises in his prologues that turns out to be surprisingly interesting. The question of who the theater is for, and what it owes its audience, and what, if anything, it owes the truth. End of Lecture 3.